The beginning of my story with Sila and Troy is one that starts like many others with that perfect high school love story. They were inseparable back in the day, the type of couple that seemed destined to last forever. But life, as it often does, had other plans for them. Troy was never what people would call traditionally handsome. He wasn't the tall, chiseled athlete or the charismatic guy that made heads turn, but he was solid in all the ways that mattered. The kind of guy who worked hard, loved harder, and was there when you needed him. That's what drew Sila to him at first. In high school, where everyone was chasing status or trying to fit into some box, Troy was just Troy, unapologetically himself. He treated Sila like a queen. Back then, she didn't care much about appearances. They were young and deeply in love, and to her, nothing else mattered. They married young, right after college, and settled into life together. Sila worked in PR, a demanding industry that had her constantly surrounded by polished people, beautiful, ambitious, and always looking to move up the ladder. In contrast, Troy was a carpenter. He loved working with his hands, building things from the ground up, and he was good at it. But as the years rolled on, something began to shift. Sila's work environment started to affect how she viewed her life, and more importantly, how she viewed Troy. She loved him, no doubt about that, but she began to notice things she hadn't before, or maybe she had, but they didn't matter then. The way people would glance at him when they were out together, the way her co-workers, sleek and well-groomed, would throw little looks his way during corporate events or social gatherings. Troy didn't fit into her world anymore, at least not the way Sila wanted him to. At first, it was little things. Sila would gently tease Troy about his appearance, trying to mask her growing insecurity. "Babe, maybe you should wear something nicer tonight," she'd say, her voice light, but her eyes giving away the truth. Troy, ever the easygoing one, would shrug and laugh it off. He was comfortable in his skin, always had been, and didn't feel the need to impress anyone but Sila. But it didn't stop there. As the years passed, the teasing turned into something darker, something that hurt. Sila began making jokes at his expense, sometimes even in front of their friends. It was as if she was trying to laugh off the embarrassment she felt for not having the type of partner who matched the image she now thought she deserved. So it didn't help that Troy never said anything about it. He'd just take the hits with a forced smile, trying to make her happy. The cracks in their relationship started to show, but they kept moving forward. They didn't have kids, which somehow made things both easier and harder. Easier because they could each throw themselves into their work and ignore the growing distance between them. Harder because without the distraction of children, there was no buffer for the tension that simmered beneath the surface. There were strange moments too. Small things that added up over time. Sila started coming home late more often, setting work functions or last-minute meetings. Troy didn't question it. He trusted her. But there were moments when he noticed a change in her, like the time he found an unfamiliar brand of perfume on her coat, a scent far too expensive for the Sila he knew. When he asked about it, she laughed and said it was just something one of the girls at work was trying out. "You know how it is, we all share things," she'd say, dismissing his concerns with a kiss on the cheek. Then there was the sudden obsession with her appearance. Sila had always been beautiful, but lately it was like she was trying to outshine everyone in the room. New clothes, a drastic haircut, constant trips to the gym. She even started working with a personal trainer, something that struck Troy as odd. Sila had never been one to care much about fitness before, but now she seemed obsessed. He tried to shake off his unease. Maybe she was just going through something. Maybe the pressures of her job were getting to her, and this was her way of coping. So he let it slide, as he always did, focusing on his own work and trying to keep their life together running smoothly. The turning point came at one of Sila's PR parties. These events were always glamorous, filled with the kind of people Sila had begun to admire more than her own husband. Troy hated these gatherings, but attended for her sake, always feeling out of place among the polished men in their tailored suits, while he stood there in his off-the-rack attire, nursing a beer. This time, though, things took a turn for the worse. The night had started off as they always did, with Sila introducing Troy to her colleagues, all flashing their white, perfect smiles. The jokes started flowing as the drinks did. Sila, already a couple of glasses of wine deep, began to make her usual jokes at Troy's expense. But this time, she went too far. In front of her boss and a few of their colleagues, she made a snide comment about Troy's blue-collar charm, laughing as if it was the funniest thing in the world. For the first time, Troy didn't laugh along. Something in him snapped. Right there in front of everyone, he let her have it. "You think it's funny to put me down like this? After everything I've done for you, everything I've put up with. You're ashamed of me, Sila. Admit it. You're ashamed of who I am." His voice was low, but it was enough to make the group fall silent. Sila stood frozen, her face pale as she realized just how much she had hurt him over the years. "I'm done," Troy said simply, turning and walking out of the party without another word. Sila was stunned. She tried to follow him, to apologize, but Troy was already gone. And for the first time in their marriage, he didn't come back that night. The next morning, he told her he was done with the marriage. He couldn't take it anymore. After Troy walked out that night, something in Sila broke. She hadn't expected it. Sure, she knew she had crossed a line with her jokes, but in her mind, it was all just fun. They'd always had that kind of back and forth, or at least she thought they did. She never imagined Troy would leave her not like this. That night, she waited up for him, sitting on the couch in the dark, nursing a glass of wine, hoping that maybe he'd cool off, come home, and they could talk it out. But when the front door never opened, her heart sank. She knew this wasn't just one of their usual arguments. This was something deeper, something that had been festering for a long time. The next morning, when Troy came back to the house, he wasn't the same man she had married. His face was hard, his eyes cold in a way she had never seen before. He didn't look angry, just defeated. That hurt her more than anything. Troy had always been the steady one, the calm in the storm. But now she realized she had been the storm all along. "I can't do this anymore, Sila," he said, as soon as he walked in. No greeting, no small talk, just that one sentence that hit her like a punch to the gut. "Troy, please, I didn't mean." "Yeah, you did," he cut her off, his voice quiet but firm. "You've been doing it for years. I've let it slide because I love you. I've taken the jokes, the little digs, because I thought, I don't know what I thought, that you'd snap out of it, that maybe it was just a phase." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the living room. "But I can't take it anymore. I can't be the punchline in my own marriage." Sila stood frozen, her hands trembling as she tried to find the right words to make this all go away. She had hurt him, deeply, and it wasn't just last night. It was years of little comments, of making him feel less than, and she hadn't even realized it. Or maybe she had, but didn't want to admit it. "Troy, please, I'm sorry. I'll change, I swear. It was a joke. I didn't mean to." "A joke?" Troy laughed bitterly. "It hasn't felt like a joke in a long time. You make me feel like I'm not good enough for you, like you're embarrassed to be with me. Hell, maybe you are." "No, Troy, that's not true," she said, her voice shaking. "I love you. You know I do. Then why do you treat me like this?" His voice cracked, and for a moment, Sila saw the pain behind his anger. "Why do you always have to make me feel like I'm less than you? Like I'm just some guy you settled for, because you couldn't find anything better?" Her heart twisted. That's not what she had meant. Not at all. But she had done it, hadn't she? Over the years in her insecurity, she had tried to make herself feel better by pushing him down. She didn't even know why. Troy had always been good to her. He loved her in ways no one else ever had. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped appreciating that. "Troy, I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't realize." Yeah, well, you did." His voice was softer now, but no less resolute. "And I don't know if I can come back from this. I'm tired, Sila. I'm tired of feeling like I'm never going to be enough for you." She took a step toward him, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I think we need some time apart," he said quietly. "I need to figure out what I want, what I deserve." It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Sila couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This couldn't be happening. Troy couldn't leave her. He was her rock, the one constant in her life. Without him, she didn't know who she was. "Please don't leave," she begged, tears streaming down her face now. "I'll change, I promise. I'll do anything." And Troy looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I don't think you can change, Kla," he said softly. "I think this is who you are." And with that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving her standing there in the silence. Her heart shattered into a million pieces. The days after that were a blur. Sila had moved back in with her parents, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. It was humiliating. She felt like a failure, not just in her marriage, but in life. Her parents, bless them, didn't pry too much. They didn't ask for details, though she could tell they wanted to. Her mother would give her those long, concerned looks, while her father just kept his distance, as if he wasn't quite sure how to handle a daughter going through a divorce. Sila spent most of her days in a fog. She tried to go to work, tried to focus on the projects in front of her, but her mind kept drifting back to Troy. She missed him. Missed the way he would smile at her in the morning, the way he'd rub her back when she was stressed. She missed the little things she had taken for granted, the way he always made sure her car had gas, or the way he'd leave her coffee ready in the kitchen when he left early for work. But more than that, she missed the man he was. The man who had loved her without condition, who had stood by her even when she didn't deserve it. And now, because of her own insecurities, she had lost him. At first, she tried to reach out. She sent Troy texts, called him late at night, left tearful voicemails apologizing for everything, begging him to come back. But his responses were short, cold even. "I need time, Sila," he would say. "We both need time." Weeks turned into months, and slowly, Celia began to lose hope. It became clear that Troy wasn't coming back. He had filed for divorce, and though she had tried to fight it at first, eventually she signed the papers. There was no point in dragging it out. He was done. The realization hit her like a freight train. This was her life now. Alone, a single woman at 29, living in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by reminders of a life she had thrown away. Her depression sank in deep. She barely left the house, barely ate. Her friends from work tried to check in, but she avoided them. She couldn't bear to face them, not after everything that had happened. It was easier to just disappear, to wallow in the mess she had made. But there was one person who hadn't disappeared: Jake. Jake was a colleague, someone she had met through work. He was charming, successful, and everything Troy wasn't. Where Troy was grounded and steady, Jake was exciting, unpredictable. He had an energy about him that drew people in, including Celia. They had always had a bit of a flirtation at work, but Celia had never acted on it, not when she was married. But now things were different. It was inevitable, really. Looking back, Celia could see how everything with Jake had been leading to this moment. It started innocently enough: longer conversations after meetings, shared jokes that no one else understood, and the occasional accidental brush of his hand against hers. At first, Celia thought nothing of it. Jake was just a friend, a distraction from the loneliness that had taken over her life since Troy left. But as the weeks passed, their interactions grew more intense, more intimate, until it became clear that it was more than just friendly banter. The first time it happened, it was like crossing a line she hadn't even realized she was approaching. They had been working late on a project at the office, one of those nights where everyone else had long gone home, leaving the two of them alone in the dimly lit space. The tension between them had been building for days, both of them dancing around it, pretending it wasn't there. Celia remembered that night vividly. She had been sitting at her desk, staring blankly at the computer screen, her mind wandering as Jake worked across the room. He had come over to check on her progress, leaning over her shoulder to look at the screen. She could feel the heat of his body, the scent of his cologne filling the space around her. And then, without thinking, she turned her head, and suddenly their faces were inches apart. There was a pause, a brief moment where they both knew what was about to happen, but neither moved. Then Jake leaned in, closing the distance between them, and their lips met in a soft, hesitant kiss. It wasn't passionate at first, more like testing the waters, but it didn't stay that way for long. The kiss deepened, growing more urgent, as if all the tension that had been simmering between them for weeks was finally boiling over. Celia pulled back for a second, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Jake, we shouldn't, but the words were half-hearted, and Jake knew it. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing against her cheek. Celia, you deserve to feel wanted. You deserve this. His words broke down the last of her resistance. It had been so long since she felt desired, since she felt like someone truly wanted her. Troy had always been steady, dependable, but with Jake, it was different. There was a fire, a spark that had been missing for so long. And in that moment, Celia didn't care about the consequences. She just wanted to feel alive again. Before she knew it, they were tangled in each other, hands roaming, clothes being discarded carelessly around the room. They ended up on the office couch, their bodies pressed together in a frenzy of passion that left Celia breathless. It was fast, intense, and messy, but it was everything she had been craving for months. Afterwards, they lay there in the quiet of the office, the only sound the distant hum of the building's air conditioning. Celia stared up at the ceiling, her body still buzzing from the intensity of what had just happened. Jake lay beside her, his arm draped lazily over her stomach, a satisfied grin on his face. For a moment, she let herself bask in the afterglow, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. But then reality came crashing back in. What had she done? This wasn't just a casual fling. She had crossed a line, betrayed everything she had promised herself after Troy left. She had sworn that she would never do this, that she wouldn't let her loneliness drive her into someone else's arms. But here she was, lying next to Jake, her body still tingling from the heat of their encounter. Guilt washed over her in waves, but she pushed it down. She couldn't deal with that right now. She couldn't let herself feel bad about something that had felt so good in the moment. Jake turned to her, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. You okay? He asked softly. Celia nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, I'm fine. But she wasn't. Not really. The days after that night were a blur. Jake and Celia continued their affair in secret, meeting up after work, stealing moments together whenever they could. It became an addiction for her, a way to escape the crushing guilt and loneliness that had consumed her life since the divorce. Every time they were together, she felt a little less broken, a little more like the woman she used to be before everything fell apart. But as much as she tried to convince herself that it didn't mean anything, that it was just sex, she knew deep down that it was more than that. Jake made her feel wanted, desired in a way that Troy never had. With Jake, there was no history, no baggage. It was just the two of them, lost in each other. Of course, it couldn't last. One night, as Kyla was leaving Jake's apartment after another heated encounter, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing on the street, just across the road, was Troy. But he hadn't seen her yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. He was there, in front of Jake's building, talking to someone, another woman. By the looks of it, Sila froze, her heart hammering in her chest. What was he doing here? How could this be happening? Of all the places, of all the moments, she ducked back into the shadow of the building's entrance, hoping he wouldn't spot her. But it was too late. Troy's eyes flicked in her direction, and in that split second, she saw the recognition in his face. His expression darkened, the shock of seeing her there clear in his eyes. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the distance between them feeling like a chasm. Sila didn't know what to do, what to say. Her mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, but none came. There was nothing she could say to fix this. Troy took a step forward, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "Sila," he said, his voice low and full of hurt. "What are you doing here?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was caught, and they both knew it. The world seemed to freeze in that moment, as Kyla stood frozen in the shadow of Jake's building, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the hurt in Troy's eyes, the disbelief as he processed what was happening. She was here, at Jake's place, leaving after hours. There wasn't any other explanation Troy knew. He had to. Sila felt a knot tighten in her stomach as Troy took another step toward her. The street, which had been so busy with people and cars just minutes before, now felt deserted, like it was just the two of them in some isolated, cruel universe. "Sila," Troy said again, his voice quieter this time, but full of so much pain it nearly broke her. "What are you doing here?" Her mouth felt dry, her pulse racing in her ears, and still no words came. What could she say? There was no lie she could tell that would erase what was so plainly in front of him. She had been with Jake, and she knew Troy wasn't stupid. He would piece it together, but she had to try, didn't she? She owed him that much. Or maybe she owed him more than that, but right now, all she could think about was trying to make this moment go away. She stammered, her voice small, her throat tightening. She hated herself for how weak she sounded, but the words wouldn't come out right. How could they? She had ruined everything. Troy's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he closed the distance between them. "Don't," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. "Don't lie to me, Sila. Not now." Sila winced at the anger in his voice. This was a side of Troy she had never really seen before, not directed at her. He had always been patient, always so understanding, even when she didn't deserve it, but now there was no more patience, no more forgiveness in his eyes. Just pain. "I'm not lying," she whispered, but even she didn't believe the words as they left her mouth. Troy shook his head, his fists still clenched tight at his sides. He looked like he wanted to punch something, but instead, he just exhaled sharply, as if trying to rein his emotions. "I've been trying to figure it out for weeks," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. "Why you were pulling away, why you were acting so strange. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think you could." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to the ground as if he couldn't bear to look at her anymore. The guilt hit Sia like a freight train, crushing her under its weight. She opened her mouth again, trying to find some way to explain, to justify what she had done, but the truth was there was no justification. "I'm sorry, Troy," she finally whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just what?" He snapped, his eyes snapping back to hers, furious now. "It just happened? You think that makes it better? You think that changes anything?" Tyla flinched at his words, the tears spilling over her cheeks now. "No, I know it doesn't," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to?" Troy barked out a bitter laugh. "You didn't mean to cheat on me? How does that even make sense, Kyla? You made a choice. Every time you were with him, you made a choice? I don't act like it was some accident." The harsh reality of his words cut through her like a knife. He was right. She had made a choice. Again and again. Every time she went to Jake's place, every time she let him touch her, she had chosen to betray the man who had loved her unconditionally for years. And now she had to live with the consequences. "I don't know why I did it," Sila whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was lonely, and I felt so empty after everything with us. I was confused. I wasn't thinking straight." Troy shook his head again, but this time he didn't say anything. He just stared at her, his expression somewhere between heartbreak and disgust. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then stopped, looking past her for a second, his jaw tightening. And then she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Sila turned slowly, dread sinking deep into her stomach, as she saw Jake walking toward them. He must have noticed Troy when he looked out the window or something. Of course, he had come down to check what was happening. Of all the times for him to show up, Jake approached with that same calm confident stride that had once made Selah feel safe, but now it just made her feel sick. He nodded at Troy, as if this were just some normal interaction. "Troy," he said simply. Troy's eyes darkened as they locked onto Jake, and for a moment, Selah thought he was going to throw a punch. She half wanted him to. But instead, Troy just glared at Jake with a look so full of hatred that it sent a shiver down her spine. "So this is him, huh?" Troy asked, his voice low, dangerous. "This is the guy you threw everything away for?" Jake shifted, glancing at Selah for a split second before turning back to Troy. "Look, man, I'm not here to cause more problems. So then why do you leave?" Troy interrupted, his voice icy. "This is between me and my wife." Selah cringed at the word wife. It felt like a reminder of the life she had destroyed, a life she no longer deserved to claim. Jake hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. He glanced at Selah again, this time with a look that seemed to ask her if she wanted him to stay. But she couldn't bring herself to say anything. She was too overwhelmed, too caught between the two men she had hurt. After a tense pause, Jake finally took a step back. "Fine," he said, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "I'll go. But Selah, if you need anything." "She doesn't need anything from you," Troy snapped, his eyes never leaving Jake's. "Just go." Jake hesitated for another moment, his expression tight, but then he nodded and walked away, leaving Selah and Troy standing alone again on the street. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Selah could feel the weight of Troy's gaze on her, heavy and full of unspoken accusations. She didn't know how to fix this, how to make him understand that she hadn't meant for things to turn out this way. But there was no fixing it. She had broken something between them that could never be mended. Finally, Troy exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging as if the fight had drained out of him. "I loved you, Selah," he said quietly, and the sadness in his voice nearly broke her. "I loved you more than anything. And you couldn't even respect me enough to be honest." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. Selah wanted to argue, to tell him that it wasn't true, that she had loved him too, but deep down she knew that it wasn't enough. She had taken his love for granted, and now she was paying the price. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, the words feeling hollow now. "I don't know what else to say." Troy just shook his head. "There's nothing else to say," he replied, his voice cold and distant. "We're done." "Fine." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Selah standing alone on the sidewalk, watching him disappear into the night. This time she knew he wasn't coming back. Selah stood there long after Troy had disappeared from sight, her body numb, her mind racing. His words echoed in her head were done. She knew he meant it. There was no fixing this, no coming back from the betrayal she had committed. This was her reality now. She had destroyed her marriage, lost the one person who had always been there for her. As the cold night air settled around her, the weight of what she had done crashed down on her, suffocating. The streetlights flickered above her, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out into the void. It was over. Everything was over. Eventually, she turned and walked home, the quiet of the streets surrounding her like a shroud. Her parents' house loomed in the distance, a place that no longer felt like a refuge but a reminder of her failure. She hated herself for ending up here, for being the woman who cheated on her husband and threw away the only real love she had ever known. The worst part was, she couldn't even pinpoint why she had done it. Was it the loneliness, the feeling of inadequacy she had never voiced? Or was it something darker, something inside her that was always searching for more, never satisfied? When she opened the front door, her parents were sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the tea reflecting off their concerned faces. They had grown used to seeing her come and go at odd hours, not saying much, but tonight felt different. She could see it in their eyes, the pity, the worry. She was their daughter, and she had failed spectacularly. Her mother gave her a soft, sad smile. "You okay, honey?" Selah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She couldn't bear to talk about it, not now, not after what had just happened. She mumbled something about needing sleep and slipped upstairs to her room, closing the door behind her. The room, with its familiar childhood relics, felt suffocating. It was like being trapped in a time warp, surrounded by memories of a simpler time when life wasn't so complicated, and love seemed like something unbreakable. Now, she knew better. Love was fragile, and she had shattered it with her own hands. She lay down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind replaying the scene with Troy over and over again, the way he had looked at her, the pain in his eyes, the finality in his voice when he said they were done. She had lost him for good. There would be no more late-night texts, no more shared mornings, no more Troy. He was gone, and it was all her fault. The days that followed were a blur of silence and isolation. Selah barely left the house, spending most of her time locked away in her room. She couldn't face the world, couldn't face herself. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from Jake, but she ignored them. She couldn't deal with him. Not now. He had been a temporary distraction, something to fill the void, but now even the thought of him made her sick. What had she been thinking? How could she have been so reckless, so selfish? Jake tried calling, leaving voicemail after voicemail, each one more desperate than the last. Sila, please call me back. I need to know you're okay. But she wasn't okay. She hadn't been okay for a long time, and Jake was the last person who could help her now. One afternoon, after what felt like weeks of avoiding him, Jake showed up at her parents' house. He knocked on the door, persistent and unyielding, and Scylla knew she couldn't hide forever. Her mother gave her a sympathetic look as she opened the door, revealing Jake standing on the front porch. Scylla, he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. Can we talk? She stared at him for a long moment, unsure of what to say. Part of her wanted to slam the door in his face, to blame him for everything that had gone wrong. But the truth was, this wasn't Jake's fault. She had made her own choices. She had been the one to cheat, the one to lie, the one to destroy her marriage. Without a word, she stepped outside, closing the door behind her as she walked past him toward the yard. He followed her, his eyes full of concern, but she didn't look at him. She couldn't, not yet. I know things are messed up right now, Jake began, his voice gentle, but I care about you, Scylla. I want to be there for you. She stopped walking, her back to him, her shoulders tense. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he didn't know her, that he wasn't what she needed. But she couldn't. She didn't have the energy for anger anymore. Jake, she said quietly, still not turning around, I can't do this anymore. There was a long pause, and she could feel him watching her, trying to make sense of her words. What do you mean? I mean us, she said, finally turning to face him. I can't be with you. Jake blinked, his expression a mix of confusion and hurt. But I thought, I was using you, she interrupted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. I was lonely, and I didn't know how to deal with it. You were just there. Jake took a step back, his face falling. Scylla, that's not fair. None of this is fair, she shot back, her voice rising. I've ruined everything. I ruined my marriage, I ruined my life, and now I can't keep pretending that being with you is going to fix anything. He stared at her, his hands clenched at his sides. I care about you, he repeated, his voice desperate. I thought we had something real. Scylla shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't real, Jake. Not for me. I was trying to fill a void, and I made a mess of everything. You deserve better than that. You deserve better than me. Jake was silent for a long time, his expression hardening as the reality of her words sank in. Finally, he nodded, his face pale. If that's how you feel, he said quietly, then I guess there's nothing left to say. She nodded, unable to speak as the tears streamed down her cheeks. Jake turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the yard, the cold wind biting at her skin. This time she didn't feel relief. She just felt empty. In the weeks that followed, Scylla tried to rebuild her life, but it was like trying to put together a shattered vase. Too many pieces were missing. She went back to work, forcing herself through the motions, but her heart wasn't in it. Everything reminded her of what she had lost, what she had thrown away. Troy had moved on. She knew that. He didn't answer her calls anymore, didn't return her texts. She had seen pictures of him on social media, looking happy, looking free. It was like he had found a way to live without her, and maybe that was for the best. She had caused him enough pain. As for Jake, he disappeared from her life as quickly as he had entered it. He transferred to another office, and Scylla heard through the grapevine that he had started dating someone new. It stung, but she couldn't blame him. He deserved better than the wreckage she had left behind. And so, Scylla was left to pick up the pieces on her own. She had no one to blame but herself. The loneliness she had felt before was nothing compared to the crushing emptiness she now carried with her every day. But maybe in time she would learn to live with it. Maybe one day she would forgive herself for what she had done. But for now, all she could do was face the reality of the choices she had made and try, somehow, to move forward, alone.